The air inside the lantern room was thick with the reek of vaporized kerosene and cold salt. It was a smell Arthur had carried in his clothes for so long that he no longer recognized it as an odor. To him, it was simply the smell of breathing. He stood on the cast-iron gallery surrounding the brass housing, his hands leathered and grayed by decades of handling cold oil cans and brass polish. Outside the thick, curved glass panes, the Atlantic did not look like water. It looked like a vast sheet of poured lead, utterly flat, stretching into a fog so dense that it seemed to press against the glass like wet wool. No waves broke against the jagged teeth of the Black Ledge tonight. The sea was still, unnaturally still, and held the dark, toxic sheen of liquid mercury. Arthur pulled a heavy silver pocket watch from his vest. The hands pointed to 2:57. 3 minutes. He slid the watch back into his pocket, took a breath that tasted of salt rust, and reached for the heavy iron crank set into the wall beside the clockwork pedestal. The mechanism drove the massive Fresnel lens, keeping its 4 heavy bullseye lenses rotating smoothly atop a bath of liquid mercury. If the clockwork stopped, the lens stopped. If the lens stopped, the light became a stationary beam, a dead eye staring uselessly into the mist. With a grunt that sounded like grinding stones, Arthur leaned his weight into the handle. Clack, clack, clack. The iron teeth of the internal gears groaned as he wound the heavy lead weight up the central shaft of the tower. Each revolution sent a shudder through his cracked knuckles and down his spine. 30 turns. That was the rule. 30 turns every 3 hours, day in, day out, without fail. As the weight reached the top of its chamber, the gears settled into their rhythmic, clicking cadence. The great glass lens above him slid through its circular track, catching the intense white flare of the mantle and projecting 4 long, brilliant green beams out into gray wall fog. Green light swept across the glass. 1, 2, 3, 4. Always green, Arthur muttered to himself, his voice raspy from disuse. Never white, never yellow. He didn't know when the glass had been tinted green. It was just the way things were on the ledge. The green light cut through the mist, casting sickly emerald halos across the slate floor and painting Arthur's hollow cheeks in shades of decay. Satisfied that the clockwork was holding its pace, Arthur wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag and walked down the spiraling cast-iron staircase. His boots made a hollow, echoing chime against the open risers, a sound that echoed down all 120 steps to the living quarters below. Halfway down, he paused. The kitchen was cold. The cast-iron stove sat dark in the corner, its flue choked with soot that smelled of wet ashes. Sitting at the long oak table in the center of the room was Leo. Leo was 12 years old. He had been 12 years old for as long as Arthur could remember. He wore a knitted blue wool sweater that was fraying at the cuffs and dark canvas trousers, stiffened with brine. On the table before him lay a collection of smooth sea glass, white, blue, and brown, arranged in neat, parallel lines. "You're up late, boy," Arthur said softly, stepping onto the flagstone floor. Leo did not look up immediately. He slid a piece of milky white glass half an inch to the left, aligning it perfectly with a piece of brown bottle glass. The clock on the wall stopped again. "Father," Leo said. His voice was thin and flat, like paper sliding across wood. Arthur looked at the brass wall clock above the pantry. Its pendulum hung completely vertical, motionless. The hands rested at 3:15. It had rested at 3:15 yesterday. It had rested at 3:15 3 years ago. "Doesn't matter," Arthur lied smoothly, walking to the pantry to check the oil reserve cans. "My pocket watch keeps the turn. That's all we need. Where did we get the blue glass?" Leo asked suddenly. He held up a teardrop-shaped fragment of cobalt glass to the dim light of the wall lantern. "I was trying to remember. Did we find it on the south shore?" Arthur's hand froze on the spout of the brass oil can, a small, cold knot tightened in the pit of his stomach. "You found it by the slipway, Leo. 2 weeks back. Don't you recall?" Leo stared at the blue glass, his pale blue eyes wide and vacant. He turned the piece over in his small fingers, rubbing his thumb against its frosted edge. He didn't blink. He rarely blinked these days. "No," Leo whispered. "I don't remember the slipway. Was I there?" "Of course you were," Arthur said, his tone sharpening just enough to mask a tremor in his throat. "We hauled the driftwood together. You carried the bucket. I remember the bucket, Leo murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. He laid the glass back down on the table. I remember the red paint peeling off the handle, but I don't remember the water. Arthur closed his eyes for a brief second. He felt a familiar, crawling dread creep up the back of his neck. The same cold sensation he felt whenever he looked too long into the mercury bath under the lens. He's losing another piece, Arthur thought. It's slipping out of him. Go to bed, Leo, Arthur commanded gently, stepping over the table and placing a heavy, scarred hand on the boy's small shoulder. Leo's sweater felt strangely thin under Arthur's palm, almost weightless, as if the wool were spun from air rather than sheep's fleece. The light is turning. The house is safe. Father? Yes, boy. Why doesn't the fog ever go away? Arthur turned toward the narrow window that faced the North Sea. The glass was coated in a thick crust of dried salt and condensate. Beyond it, there was no horizon, no sky, no stars, only the heavy, suffocating gray that wrapped around the ledge like a shroud. It will clear when the wind changes, Arthur said, repeating the phrase he had spoken 10,000 times before. When will the wind change? When it's time. Leo didn't argue. He stood up, leaving his sea glass in its neat rows, and walked toward a small alcove bedroom off the main hall. He didn't drag his feet, but his steps made no sound against the heavy oak floorboards. None at all. Arthur stood alone in the quiet kitchen. The only sound was a distant, rhythmic thump click of the giant clockwork far above his head, turning the green light through the fog. He walked over to the table and picked up the piece of cobalt sea glass Leo had been holding. It was cold, not cold like ice, but cold like stone that had never seen the sun. As he held it, Arthur looked down at his own knuckles. The skin across his joints was cracked and dry, lined with black grease that no soap could remove. But beneath the dirt, the flesh looked oddly translucent in the lantern light, as if he held his hand at the mantle, he might see the shadows of the floorboards right through his palm. He shoved his hand deep into his coat pocket. Then it came. It did not start as a sound, but as a vibration in the soles of his boots. The flagstones beneath his feet shuddered slightly. Then, rolling across the dead, flat water from somewhere deep within the gray bank, came the sound. Gero Lenenenenti. It was a foghorn, low, resonant, and impossibly deep. It vibrated in Arthur's teeth and rattled the tin cups hanging from the rafters. It was not the crisp, mechanical blast of a modern shore station. It sounded organic, like the dying groan of an iron-hulled leviathan lost in the dark. Arthur stiffened, his jaw locked. In the alcove bedroom, a small gasp sounded as Leo sat up in bed. "Father," Leo called out, his voice trembling. "Is that a ship?" Arthur marched to the kitchen doorway, his eyes wild, his voice dropping into a harsh, commanding whisper. "Be silent," Arthur hissed. He grabbed the doorframe, his nails digging into the soft pine. "You know the rule, Leo. You know the second rule." The boy drew the heavy wool blanket up to his chin, his eyes wide with sudden terror. "Never answer the horn," the rule said. "Never speak to the sea when it calls." Out on the leaden water, the horn blew a second time. Closer now, vibrating to the cold stone walls of the tower, shaking the very dust from the ceiling beams. "Gero Lenenenenti." It was waiting for a reply. The sound of the horn hung in the thick air long after the echo died away. It seemed to sink into the stone walls of the lighthouse, leaving behind a humming resonance that made the glass oil lamps rattle in their wall brackets. Arthur stood frozen by the doorway of Leo's small alcove, his body leaned forward, listening with every nerve. His breath came shallow and tight. "Father?" Leo whispered from beneath his thick wool blanket. The boy's voice was barely a thread of sound. "Was it calling us?" "No," Arthur said, turning around slowly. His tone was clipped, sharp as chipped flint. "It wasn't calling anything. It's just a fog tricking the air. Put your head down, Leo. Go back to sleep." "It sounded like a big boat," Leo persisted, his eyes gleaming in the amber lantern light, like the ones in the picture book, the ones with 3 masts and iron anchors. "There are no boats out there," Arthur said, stepping into the room and pulling the blanket up to the boy's chin. His fingers brushed Leo's forehead. The skin was strangely cool, free of any sweat or natural oils. It felt like dry paper. There hasn't been a boat past the Black Ledge in 30 years. Now close your eyes. The light is turning. We are safe inside. Leo didn't close his eyes right away. He stared past Arthur, out through the small square window that faced the slipway. If a boat came, would it take us to the mainland? Arthur's heart took a heavy, uneven thud against his ribs. The mainland. The word felt ancient, hollowed out by time. He hadn't thought of the mainland in so long that the idea of it felt like a story told to children, a place of green grass and dirt roads that existed only in dreams. There is no mainland, Arthur said quietly, almost to himself. There's only the ledge and the sea. Now sleep? He turned on his heel and walked out of the room, closing the heavy pine door until only a thin sliver of yellow light remained on the floorboards. Arthur climbed the spiral stairs back to the lantern room. His knees cracked with every step. The iron stairs felt colder than usual tonight, as if the fog outside were seeping straight through the 2-foot-thick granite blocks of the tower. When he reached the top, the green light was still sweeping its steady, 4-pointed circle through the dark. Sweep, pause, sweep, pause. The mercury bath beneath the lens was smooth and black, reflecting the green mantle flame like a pool of dark glass. Arthur walked to the northern pane and pressed his forehead against the iron frame. He looked down at the rocks below. The Black Ledge was little more than a jagged tooth of dark granite pushing up out of the sea. At high tide, half of it was swallowed by the water. At low tide, it exposed sharp, barnacle-encrusted reefs that could slice an oak hull to ribbons. But tonight, the water wasn't moving. There were no swells slapping against the slipway, no white foam curling over the rocks. The sea sat heavy, flat, and gray, like oil poured into a basin. Then he saw it, down by the low water mark, near the rotting timber slipway where they used to winch up the supplied dory. Something was moving. Arthur's breath fogged the glass. He reached up with his greasy rag and wiped a clear circle on the pane. It wasn't a ship. It was too small for a ship. It looked like a dark lump of driftwood tossed onto the rocks, surrounded by a faint, unnatural blue glow that flickered against the wet granite. Arthur squinted. The light was small, concentrated, and harsh, not like the soft amber of kerosene or the deep green of the lantern. It was a pale electric blue, sharp enough to cut through the gray fog like a blade. No, Arthur muttered under his breath. No, no, no. The rules of the ledge were clear. They had been written in the leather-bound logbook on the desk downstairs in his grandfather's handwriting, though Arthur could not remember ever seeing his grandfather write them. Rule 1, keep the lens rotating. Never let the mantle go dark. Rule 2, never answer the horn when the sea calls. Rule 3, what comes off the water belongs to the water. Leave it on the stone. Arthur backed away from the window. His hand instinctively went to the heavy brass key hanging from his belt, the key to the lower door. He had locked that door 20 years ago. Or was it 30? He couldn't remember. He never unlocked it. There was no need to go down to the rocks. Everything they needed was inside the tower. The flour barrels in the cellar never ran out. The oil tanks beneath the floorboards always held enough fuel for the next turn. The rain cistern was always half full of cold, slate-tasting water. He walked to the iron staircase and looked down into the dark well of the tower. Clack, clack, clack. The clockwork gears continued their slow, steady march. The lead weight was halfway down its shaft. He had 2 hours before the next wind. From down below, past the kitchen, past the cellar, came a sound that made Arthur's stomach turn. It was a wet, heavy thud against the iron-reinforced outer door at the base of the tower. Thump. Arthur froze. His hand tightened around the brass handrail until his knuckles turned as gray as salt-cured fish. Thump, thump. It wasn't the sea. The sea didn't knock. The sea slammed and roared, or it sat silent like mercury. This was deliberate. Someone or something was standing on the wet granite outside, beating a fist against the heavy oak planks. Arthur hurried down the stairs, skipping 2 steps at a time, his boots clattering against the iron risers. He flew past the kitchen door. Leo was still inside, quiet, though Arthur could hear the soft rustle of the boys' wool blanket as he stirred. "Stay there, Leo," Arthur called out as he reached the lowest landing. He stood in the narrow stone entrance hall at the base of the tower. The wall here was 5 feet thick, damp with condensation that dripped down the whitewashed masonry. At the end of the short corridor stood the outer door, heavy oak reinforced with thick iron straps, rusted black by decades of salt spray. Thump. "Hello?" A voice came from the other side. Arthur gasped. The voice was strange. It sounded young, sharp and strained, filtered through the heavy oak. It didn't sound like the low, wet groans of things that sometimes drifted past the rocks in the deep mist. It sounded human. "Is someone in there?" The voice called again. It was followed by a wet, ragged cough. "Please. My suit tore on the reef. The water's freezing. Open the damn door." Arthur took a step back, his boots crunching on the dry sand that had drifted under the doorframe. "Go away," Arthur said, his voice shaking. "You aren't supposed to be here." "What?" The voice on the outside sounded bewildered, incredulous. "What do you mean I'm not supposed to be here? I was diving off the research rig 3 miles north. My line snapped. The surge pulled me into the drift. Open the door." Arthur looked at the heavy brass lock. The iron bolt was thick, shot deep into the stone casing. "There are no research rigs," Arthur called back, staring at the keyhole. "There's nothing north of here. Only the reef and the fog." "Are you crazy?" the voice barked, followed by another fit of coughing. "I was on the Nautilus, too. We were mapping the old shelf. Listen to me. My thermal regulator is dead. I've been in the water for 40 minutes. If you don't open this door, I'm going to die of hypothermia." Hypothermia, thermal regulator, research rig. The words sounded like gibberish to Arthur. They were smooth, complex words that belonged to a language he had never heard. They didn't belong on the Black Ledge. "Rule 3, Arthur whispered to himself, his hand hovering inches from the brass key. "What comes off the water belongs to the water." "Please!" the voice screamed, slamming both hands against the wood. "I can see the light. You're running the lantern. Just let me into the entryway." A bright, electric blue beam suddenly shot through the narrow keyhole, illuminating the damp floorboards of the entrance hall. It was so bright, so clear, that it hurt Arthur's eyes. He flinched, shielding his face with his sleeve. He hadn't seen a light that sharp in his entire life. The lamp in the tower was warm, green, and heavy. This light was cold, white blue, and sharp as broken glass. Arthur reached out. His fingers touched the cold brass handle of the key. He thought of the logbook. He thought of the rules. He thought of his grandfather's phantom warnings echoing down through the stone stairs. If you open the door to the sea comes in with whatever is carrying it. "Father?" Arthur turned. Leo was standing at the top of the short flight of stairs leading up to the kitchen. The boy was holding his little tin lamp, his small face pale and hollow in the yellow glow. His eyes were wide with strange, blank curiosity. "Who is speaking outside?" Leo asked softly. "Nobody," Arthur said quickly. "Go back upstairs, Leo." "He sounds cold," Leo said. He pointed a thin, trembling finger toward the bottom of the door. "Look, Father, his light is blue." The blue light streamed through the gap under the door, painting the salt-encrusted floorboards in brilliant, artificial daylight. In that blue light, Arthur looked down at Leo's feet. The boy was standing on the bottom step, but where his boots met the wood, there was no shadow. The blue light shone right to the leather of Leo's soles, casting a faint, pale shape onto the stone behind him. Arthur felt his breath catch in his throat. "Father?" Leo asked again, stepping down one more stair. "Why is he calling for help?" From the outside, the hitting stopped. A wet slide of fabric dragged down the rough exterior wood as the stranger sank onto the stone porch. "Please," the voice whimpered, fading now, turning thin and raspy. "I have a daughter. She's at the station in St. John's. Please?" Arthur turned back to the door. His knuckles were white around the key. The silver pocket watch in his vest seemed to tick against his ribs like a dying heart. He didn't want to turn the key. He was terrified of what was on the other side. But as he looked back at Leo, at the translucent edges of the boy's frayed sweater, at the way his eyes seemed to lose their color a little more with every passing hour, Arthur realized something cold and terrible. The fog wasn't just staying outside. It was already in the room. Arthur slotted the brass key into the keyhole, turned it into the iron bolt ground back into its socket with sound like breaking stone, and pulled the heavy door open. The door swung inward with a heavy, groaning scrape against the flagstones. A blast of wet, freezing air rushed into the entryway, smelling violently of crushed kelp, cold iron, and old brine. With the air came a lump of dark, dripping matter that collapsed forward across the sill, tumbling onto the floor in a heap of synthetic fabric and metal fittings. Arthur instinctively backed away, pulling Leo behind his hip. He kept his arm outstretched, shielding the boy as if the fallen shape were an unexploded shell washed up from a naval war. The figure lay on its side, gasping. It did not look like any sailor or fisherman Arthur had ever seen. The stranger was encased in a thick, skin-tight suit of black and neon yellow neoprene, crisscrossed with rubberized straps and black composite buckles. On his back was a sleek, matte black dual-cylinder breathing apparatus, its hoses torn and dangling uselessly like severed arteries. In his right hand, the man still clutched a heavy, rectangular torch. It was the source of the blinding blue light, casting sharp, clinical glare across the whitewashed stone walls, revealing every crack in the lime and every cobweb hanging from the rafters. The diver rolled onto his back with a groan that rattled in his chest. He reached up with gloved fingers, fumbling at the latches of the thick, transparent visor attached to a hard-shell helmet. Cinchich. A hiss of pressurized air escaped as he unsealed the mask and dragged it off his head. Underneath was a young man, no older than 30, with short, dark hair soaked in seawater and a face pale with deep, bone-chilling cold. His lips were a bruised, dark purple, and his teeth chattered so violently that Arthur could hear them clicking from 5 feet away. Jesus! The young man wheezed, his eyes rolling wildly as he took in the low stone archway, the flickering oil lamp on the wall, and Arthur's heavy oilskin coat. Jesus Christ! I thought I was dead out there. Arthur stared down at him. He didn't move to help. His hand remained gripped around the hilt of the brass key in his pocket. What are you? Arthur asked. His voice was raspy, dry as chaff. The diver squinted against the dim amber light of the hall, shaking his head in confusion. What? I'm a diver. Marine Survey Team. Nautilus, too. He coughed, a wet hacking sound, and shoved himself up against the doorframe, shivering uncontrollably. My name is Miller. Julian Miller. Who are you? I am the keeper, Arthur said simply. He did not offer his name. The rules did not mention sharing names with things that came off the tide. You shouldn't have come onto the stone. The ledge doesn't take visitors. Julian let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh that turned into another shuddering cough. He looked down at his gloved hands, then up at Arthur, and finally past Arthur's shoulder to where Leo stood peeking out from behind his father's coat. A keeper? Julian rasped, wiping sea foam from his chin with the back of his hand. What do you mean, keeper? The ledge light was automated back in the 80s. It's been a solar beacon for 40 years. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp pain behind his temples, like an iron needle driving through his skull. The light is clockwork, Arthur barked, his tone hardening to mask the spike of agony in his head. It is wound every 3 hours. By hand. There is no solar. There are no visitors. Julian didn't argue. He was shivering too hard to care about the logistics of the tower. He reached up, unbuckling the heavyweight belt from his waist, and letting it crash onto the stone floor with a dull clunk. Look, man, Julian pleaded, his voice cracking with exhaustion. I don't care who you are or what you're running here. I've been in 40-degree water for almost an hour. My dry suit ripped on the reef, the suit flooded. I need a blanket. I need to get warm before my core temp drops any further. Leo stepped out from behind Arthur. His small face was filled with detached, serene curiosity. He pointed at the rectangle of light in Julian's hand. What kind of lantern is that? Leo asked softly. It doesn't have a wick. Julian looked down at his dive light, then up at the boy. For a second, despite the freezing cold racking his body, Julian froze. He stared at Leo's face, at the strange, waxy smoothness of his skin, at the faded, lifeless blue of his eyes. It's an LED, Julian stammered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the kid. It's a battery torch. Battery. Leo repeated the word carefully, tasting it like a foreign coin. What is a battery? Julian looked between the boy and the old man. The initial relief of finding land and shelter was rapidly giving way to a cold, creeping unease that had nothing to do with the temperature of the water. He looked around the entrance hall. The walls were dry-stacked granite, coated in peeling whitewash. There were no electric conduits, no plastic junction boxes, no emergency exit signs, no radio housings. The air smelled of wood smoke, lard, and ancient, stagnant dust. Where are we?" Julian asked, his voice dropping an octave as he shoved himself to his feet. He stumbled, his legs weak as water, and leaned heavily against the damp masonry. "This isn't the automated tower. The ledge beacon is a steel frame on a concrete pad. I saw the charts this morning. This tower was built in 1874, Arthur said coldly. It has 4 feet of granite at the base and 70 feet of timber above. It stands where it has always stood." Julian reached into a waterproof pouch on his chest harness and pulled out a small, rectangular slab of glass and black metal. He pressed a button on the side. The glass face flickered to life, casting a bright, square glow across his pale fingers. Arthur gasped, taking an involuntary step back. Leo leaned forward, his eyes wide, mesmerized by the glowing square. "No signal," Julian muttered, tapping the glass screen furiously with his thumb. "No satellite link. GPS is completely dead. How the hell can GPS be dead?" He flipped the device over, showing the screen to Arthur. "Look at this. The internal clock says August 1st, 2026, 3:42 a.m. What year do you think it is? Oh, man." Arthur looked at the glowing numbers on the tiny glass plate. The numbers looked absurd. They were thin, digital, glowing with an artificial precision that made no sense. "It's 1938, Arthur said automatically. The words left his mouth before he could even think about them. He didn't know why he said it. He had never thought about the year. Time on the ledge was measured in turns of the crank, in 3-hour intervals, in the filling of the oil cans and the sweeping of the green light. But as the number left his tongue, it felt right. It felt like an old anchor dropped into deep mud. Julian stopped tapping his screen. He looked up, his brow furrowed in utter bewilderment. "What did you just say?" Julian asked quietly. "It's 1938, Arthur repeated, his hand tightening into a fist. "My grandfather took the keep in 1912. My father died on the rocks in 24. I took the ledger after the Great War." Julian stared at Arthur for a long, terrible moment. Then he looked down at the glowing screen of his phone, then back to the stone walls, and finally at Leo. "You're lying," Julian whispered, though there was no conviction in his voice, only a rising, frantic dread. You're running some kind of off-grid historical preserve? A living museum. This is the Black Ledge Light," Arthur said, stepping forward and placing his hand on the heavy oak door. "And you are breaking the rules by being inside it." Before Julian could answer, a sudden, sharp shudder ran to the iron staircase behind them. Clack, 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 clack. The sound came from high above in the tower, a frantic, irregular chatter of iron gears grinding against iron gears. The steady, rhythmic thump-click of the clockwork pedestal had broken its cadence. Upper floorboards creaked violently. From the gallery above, the green light flickered. It didn't sweep. It stuttered, green, dark, like a dying eye blinking against the fog. Arthur's face drained to what little color it possessed. "The weight," Arthur gasped, his eyes darting toward the ceiling. "The weight is dropping too fast." He turned and bolted up the stone stairs, his boots hammering against the steps, abandoning the diver and the strange glowing glass on the floor below. "Father!" Leo cried out, chasing after him with his small tin lamp. Julian stood alone in the entrance hall for 3 seconds, shivering in his leaking dry suit, staring at the empty stone archway. "Hey, wait!" Julian yelled, grabbing his heavy dive light and stumbling up the stairs after them. "Wait for me. Don't leave me down here." Arthur reached the kitchen landing in a dead run. The room was bathed in erratic, green flashes coming down to the open spiral staircase from the lantern room above. The cast-iron stove was shivering on its legs. On the kitchen table, Leo's rows of sea glass were vibrating, bouncing against the oak boards like teeth in a cold jaw. And from outside the kitchen window, from the direction of the dead leaden sea, came the foghorn again. Giro. It was louder now, so loud that the glass panes in the kitchen window bowed inward under the pressure of the sound. It didn't sound like it was 3 miles out on the water anymore. It sounded like it was standing on the slipway. Arthur took the spiral stairs 3 at a time, his old heart hammering a wild, irregular rhythm against his ribs. The green flashes above grew more frantic, pulsing like the distressed heartbeat of a dying beast. Behind him, the clatter of Julian's rubber-soled dive boots echoed up the iron risers, accompanied by the diver's ragged, wheezing gasps. What is that sound? Julian screamed from somewhere below on the stairs, his voice bouncing off the granite walls. Is that a ship's horn? Is someone running aground? Arthur didn't answer. He burst through the trapdoor onto the gallery floor of the lantern room. The sight made his blood run cold. The heavy cast-iron housing of the clockwork pedestal was rattling violently, sparks spitting from the governor flywheels as they spun out of control. The massive lead weight, suspended inside the central shaft of the tower, had slipped its brass catch and was plummeting toward the cellar below. With the drive mechanism runaway, the great Fresnel lens was spinning at a frantic, terrifying speed. The 4 brilliant green beams of light weren't sweeping the fog anymore. They were whipping through the room like the blades of a thresher, flashing across the curved glass pane so fast that the lantern room looked like it was trapped in continuous, nauseating lightning storm. Rig. The iron gears shrieked, metal grinding against metal as friction heated the dry teeth of the mechanism. The brake! Arthur roared, throwing himself across the gallery floor toward the pedestal. His boots slipped on a pool of dark, silvery fluid that had sloshed out a basin. Mercury. The violent spinning of the multi-ton glass lens had caused a liquid mercury bath, the frictionless bed upon which the massive optic floated, to slosh over its iron lip. Drops of heavy, liquid metal were scattering across the floorboards like silver beads, pooling in the grooves of the iron decking. Arthur slammed his weight against the emergency handbrake lever. Screech! A cloud of acrid smoke billowed from the leather brake shoe as it pressed against the spinning flywheel. The smell of burning leather and hot iron instantly filled the cramped glass room, mixing with the sickening, sweet metallic tang of vaporized mercury. Slowly, agonizingly, the frantic spinning of the green beams began to drag. 1 turn, 2 turns, 3 turns, until the mechanism gave a final, shuddering clack and locked dead in place. Silence dropped over the tower, like a wet canvas. The lens had stopped at an angle. 2 of its intense, emerald beams were pinned directly against the thick fog outside, burning 2 static, green tunnels into the gray wall. The other 2 beams shot across the interior of the lantern room, bathing the iron walls and the 3 figures in a harsh, unblinking glare. Julian stumbled up to the trapdoor, clutching his chest, his dive torch swinging wildly in his hand. He stopped dead, staring at the scene in absolute shock. What just happened? Julian gasped, wiping a hand across his sweaty brow. The mercury, Arthur muttered, his voice shaking as he knelt beside the pedestal. It sloshed. It lost its level. He reached out with a bare, callous hand to gather the stray beads of mercury on the floor, trying to sweep them back toward the iron bath. Hey, don't touch that, Julian yelled, stepping forward to grab Arthur's arm. That's raw mercury. It's extremely toxic. The vapors alone can cause neurological damage. Julian's hand caught Arthur's coat sleeve and slipped right through the fabric. Julian gasped, jerking his hand back as if he had touched a red-hot iron. He stumbled backward, hitting his shoulders against the thick glass pane of the lantern room. What the... Julian whispered, his face turning paper white. He looked down at his gloved hand, then at Arthur. What the hell are you? Arthur didn't look up. He continued to scrape the silver beads of mercury across the iron floorboards with his thumb. But where his hands moved to the green light of the stationary mantle, Julian could see it clearly now. There was no mistake. Arthur's hands did not cast a shadow on the floor. The emerald light passed through Arthur's coat, through his shirt, through his bones, illuminating the floorboards beneath him as if he were made of translucent glass. Leo climbed up to the trapdoor next, holding his small tin lamp. The boy looked tired, his small shoulders slumped under the oversized wool sweater. He walked over to the edge of the mercury pool and knelt down beside his father. "Father," Leo said softly. "The sea is quiet now." Julian backed further away, pressing himself flat against the glass wall of the tower. He shined his bright blue LED torch directly at Leo's back. The blue beam passed straight through the boy's chest, projecting a clear, sharp circle of light onto the brass clockwork housing on the far side of the room. Inside the boy's outline, there were no organs, no ribs, no beating heart. Only a soft, fading haze that looked like condensed mist. "You're dead," Julian breathed, his voice breaking into a terrified sob. "Oh, God, you're both dead." Arthur finally stopped scraping the mercury. He stood up slowly, his joints making no sound, his shadow entirely absent from the wall behind him. He turned to face the young diver. "I am the keeper," Arthur said. His tone was empty, robbed of all anger, leaving only a flat, desolate weight. "I wind the clock. I keep the light turning." "No!" Julian shouted, pulling his dive knife from his leg sheath with a metallic snick, holding it out with a trembling hand. "No! I fell off the survey rig. I'm in hypothermia. I'm hallucinating. This is nitrogen narcosis or severe cold exposure. My brain is shutting down." "Your brain is fine, Mr. Miller," Arthur said quietly. He walked to the window and looked out at the two green beams piercing the fog. "It's your memory that's holding on." "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an escape that didn't involve dropping 70 feet down a dark iron shaft. "The horn," Leo spoke up, pointing his small finger out the glass pane toward the leaden sea. "Look, Father." The boat didn't leave. Arthur stepped closer to the pane, shielding his eyes from the glare of the static green beam. Out on the flat, mercury-colored water, just past the jagged teeth of the Black Ledge rocks, something was sitting in the fog. It was not a modern research vessel. It was a rusted, twisted hulk of an early 20th century coal steamer. Its iron superstructure was crushed, its single smokestack bent at a grotesque 45-degree angle, its wooden deck planks splintered and black with old coal dust. It sat motionless in the water, wrapped in thick tendrils of gray mist that seemed to drag from its broken rigging like rotting cobwebs. On the bow of the ghost ship, standing silently along the rusted iron railing, were dozens of figures. They did not move. They did not wave. They stood shoulder to shoulder, dressed in wet, salt-caked clothes from a century ago, flat caps, wool shawls, heavy sea coats. Their faces were pale, washed-out gray shapes in the mist, their eyes fixed entirely on the green light of the tower. Julian scrambled to the window, peering out past Arthur's shoulder. His mouth fell open, the dive knife slipping from his numb fingers and clattering to the deck. "The SS Southern Cross," Julian whispered, his voice stripped of all denial, leaving only pure, unadulterated horror. That's the Southern Cross. It went down on the ledge in November 1938. 300 passengers died. Arthur turned his head slowly to look at Julian. 1938. Arthur repeated softly. "The year the bad storm came." Julian looked from the ghost ship to Arthur's hollow face, his breath coming in short, panic hitches. "You didn't survive that storm, did you?" Julian asked, his voice barely audible above the hum of the cooling mantle. The lighthouse, the old stone tower, it didn't hold. Arthur looked down at his cracked, greasy knuckles. He raised his hand to the stationary green beam. The light shone bright and clear through his skin, through his veins, casting nothing on the floor behind him. "The storm took the slipway first," Arthur murmured, his eyes glazing over as if he were reading words written on the inside of his eyelids. Then it broke the lower door. The water came up the stairs. It filled the kitchen. It took the flour barrels. It took Leo's bed. Leo stood beside his father, looking out at the figures on the ship. He turned his face up toward Arthur. "Father?" Leo asked, his voice innocent and thin as paper. "Who was the man in the yellow suit?" Julian stiffened. He slowly lowered his eyes to his own chest, to the bright yellow and black neoprene dive suit, to the high-tech depth gauge strapped to his wrist, to the dive light in his hand. He looked down at his boots. He had been so cold when he knocked on the iron door. His fingers had been numb, his lungs burning from the salt water he had swallowed. But now, as he stood in the green light of the static lens, the shivering had stopped. The bone-chilling cold was gone. Julian slowly unbuckled the dive light from his wrist. He held his gloved hand up between his face and the green beam of the mantle. The light passed through the neon yellow neoprene. It passed through his flesh. It passed through his bones. On the iron gallery floor behind him, there was no shadow. Julian stood frozen in the emerald beam, staring at his translucent hands with a horror so profound it threatened to tear his mind apart. He moved his fingers, 1, 2, 3, for watching the green glow flicker unhindered through his knuckles. There was no pain, no feeling of cold. The hypothermia that had been racking his body just minutes ago had vanished, replaced by an awful, weightless numb. No! Julian choked out, backing away until his heels hit the iron frame of the lens pedestal. No, this is wrong. My tether snapped on the ledge. I swam up. I saw the light and I swam up. You swam to the stone, Arthur said softly. He didn't look at Julian with pity or anger. His expression was as cold and worn as the granite walls around them. The stone is where the lost come when they're done with the water. I have a life. Julian screamed, his voice cracking violently, echoing off the glass panes. I have a wife in St. John's. My daughter, Sarah, is turning 4 next month. I bought her a red bicycle. It's sitting in the garage. He grabbed the lapels of his dive suit, pulling at the thick material as if he could tear off the realization like a wet garment. But his fingers slipped through the fabric without resistance. The suit, the helmet, the dive light, they were no longer rubber and metal. They were memories, woven from the same thread of fog and denial that kept Arthur's wool coat hanging on his shoulders. Leo stepped closer to Julian. The boy reached out a small, pale hand, touching the edge of Julian's yellow sleeve. Where their fingers met, there was no sound of rustling fabric, only a faint softness like 2 currents of mist crossing one another. Did you forget your daughter's face? Leo asked quietly. Julian flinched, looking down at the boy. What? Her face, Leo repeated, his blue eyes wide and entirely vacant. I forgot my mother's face. I remember she had a bonnet with blue ribbons, but I don't know what her eyes look like anymore. Father says it's because she didn't stay on the stone. Julian stared at the child, the air leaving his lungs in a long, ragged gasp. He closed his eyes tight, desperately trying to picture his daughter. Sarah. He could see the red bicycle. He could see the yellow helmet sitting on the handlebars. He could see the dark green door of his house on Maple Street. But when he tried to look up, when he tried to see his daughter's face as she laughed in the yard, there was only a gray wall of salt fog. The features were smudged, washed out like a watercolor left in the rain. Oh, God! Julian wept, falling to his knees on the iron decking. He covered his face with his hands, but the green light shone straight through his palms, casting no shadow beneath him. I can't see her. Why can't I see her? Because the water takes the names first, Arthur said, turning away from the window. Then the faces, then the years. If you stay on the ledge long enough, you forget there was ever anything else. Arthur stepped toward the brass clockwork pedestal. The heavy gears were silent, dusted with silver droplets of mercury. The stationary lens still pinned its green beams against the dark, illuminating the ghost ship Southern Cross resting out on the Mercury Sea. Arthur looked down at the iron brake lever. For 40 years or 100 or 1,000, he had believed he was a survivor. He had believed he was a brave man doing a hard, necessary duty. Keep the light turning. Never let the mantle go dark. Protect the house. He had repeated those rules like a prayer every time the cold got into his joints, every time the flower in the cellar smelled of wet rot, every time Leo forgot another piece of his childhood. Now, looking at Julian weeping on the floor, the truth sat before Arthur like a cold plate of stone. The lighthouse wasn't protecting them from the sea. The light wasn't a warning for passing ships. It was an anchor. The green flame of the mantle, burning through the mercury-dipped lens, was a trap forged out of his own refusal to let go. When the great storm of 1938 tore the slipway away and flooded the lower rooms, Arthur hadn't saved Leo. He had died holding the boy in the dark while the water rose to the rafters. and in his desperate, dying agony, he had dragged himself up the stairs in his mind, lit the lamp, and declared that they were safe inside. He had built Morrow Hollow's watery equivalent right here on the Black Ledge, a stagnant pocket of time where nothing changed, nothing moved forward, and the dead were forced to play out the same 3-hour routine forever while their souls slowly dissolved into ash. "Father?" Leo's small voice broke the heavy quiet. Arthur turned. The boy was standing by the window, looking out at the Southern Cross. The figures on the deck of the rusted steamer were moving now. They weren't stepping forward, but their pale, jointed arms were slowly rising, pointing toward the lantern room. They weren't gesturing in anger. They were waiting. They were staring at the stationary green light, trapped in the same unblinking stares Arthur had been for decades. "The ship is waiting for the turn," Leo said softly. He looked at Arthur, his small face showing a sudden, strange clarity, a clarity that hadn't been there in a very long time. "They can't move while the light is holding them, can they?" Arthur walked slowly to the edge of the glass pedestal. He looked down into the mercury bath. In the silver pool, he saw no reflection of his face, no reflection of the brass housing, no reflection of the green mantle flame. He saw only the bottomless depth of the sea, dark, quiet, and cold. "No!" Arthur whispered, his throat tight with a grief he had deferred for nearly a century. "They can't move. None of us can." Julian raised his head from his hands, his breath hitching. He looked from Arthur to the massive iron crank sitting by the wall. "If the light goes out—" Julian rasped, his eyes wide with a mix of dread and sudden, wild realization. "What happens to us?" "The sea takes what belongs to it," Arthur said. And my daughter?" Julian's voice broke. Will I find her? Or do I just vanish?" Arthur looked at the young diver. He saw the modern yellow suit, the sleek dive light, the glowing digital screen of the phone lying discarded on the floor below. Artifact of a bright, sunlit world that had moved on 80 years after Arthur had drowned in the dark. "I don't know," Arthur said honestly. "The rules didn't say. The rules only told us how to stay." He reached out and placed his hand on the smooth, brass wheel of the fuel regulator, the valve that fed the pressurized kerosene to the green mantle. If he turned the wheel, the flame would die. The green beams would collapse. The mercury anchor would shatter, and the heavy gray wall of the fog would sweep over the Black Ledge once and for all. "Father," Leo murmured, stepping up beside him. The boy reached out his tiny, translucent hand and laid it over Arthur's rough, gray fingers on the valve. "I'm tired. My legs feel like salt." Arthur looked down at his son. He remembered the red paint peeling off the handle of the wooden bucket. He remembered the boy's laughter before the storm came. He remembered the sound of the ocean breaking against a shore that had long since disappeared from his mind. From outside, across the still, leaden water, the foghorn of the Southern Cross blew one final time. "Giro Guananananenti." It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. Arthur gripped the brass valve. The lantern room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. The brass valve beneath Arthur's hand felt neither cold nor warm. It felt like nothing at all, a phantom shape held together only by the fierce, stubborn force of his own memory. Beside him, Leo stood with his pale face turned up toward his father. The blue of the boy's eyes had faded completely now, washed into the same dull, translucent gray as the fog pressing against the curved glass panes. Yet, for the first time since the great storm, the tension in Leo's small shoulders was gone. He was not looking for his lost sea glass. He was not asking about the stopped clocks. He was simply waiting. On the iron decking behind them, Julian slowly pushed himself up to his knees. His neon-yellow dive suit looked frayed, its bright modern colors draining into gray slate of the tower floor. He stared at the valve, his chest rising and falling in silent, breathless hitches. "If you close it," Julian whispered, his voice trembling like thin glass, "the light stops. What happens to the ship out there? What happens to us?" Arthur did not turn his head. He kept his hollow gaze fixed on the bright green mantle glowing inside the glass lens housing. "The light doesn't save us, Mr. Miller," Arthur said softly. "It never did. It only holds us here, pinned like dry moss to a board while the tide washes everything else away." "I was trying to go home," Julian wept, a single clear tear slipping down his pale cheek. It did not drop onto his collar. It evaporated into a faint curl of mist before it hit his skin. I was just trying to get back to the surface. There is no surface on the ledge, Arthur replied. There is only the stone and the water beyond it. Arthur glanced down at Leo. The boy nodded, a tiny, solemn tilt of his chin. Close it, Father, Leo whispered. I want to see if Mama is on the boat. Arthur's heart gave one final, heavy ache, not a fear, but an immense, overwhelming release. He tightened his translucent fingers around the brass wheel of the regulator and turned it counterclockwise. Clack. The pressure in the kerosene line dropped instantly. The brilliant, blinding green mantle sputtered. Its intense emerald flare shrank to a sickly, pale yellow point. The two long green beams that had cut through the gray wall of fog outside flickered, dimmed, and vanished, plunging the leaden ocean into darkness. For a fraction of a second, the tiny yellow ember hung on the wick, a frail, dying star in the center of the iron tower. Then Arthur blew on it. Puff! The ember died. Darkness crashed over the lantern room, like a physical blow. Instantly, the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the tower began to break. The smell of hot oil vaporized mercury, and iron grease disintegrated, replaced by a violent, roaring rush of cold wind that smelled of crushed kelp and ancient, abyssal salt. The sound came next, not from the sea outside, but from the tower itself. Crack! A massive structural fracture tore through the thick granite walls of the lantern housing. The curved glass panes surrounding the gallery didn't just shatter. They dissolved, blowing inward like a cloud of white salt dust. The cast-iron clockwork pedestal, the mercury bath, the massive glass Fresnel lens, all of it began to thin, turning into gray, vaporous ribbons that whipped wildly in the sudden gale. Arthur! Julian screamed, but his voice was immediately swallowed by the roar of the rushing air. Julian looked down at his own body. The neon yellow of his dive suit was peeling away like dry ash in a hurricane. His boots, his dive torch, his heavy air tanks, all the artifacts of 2026, were shattering into tiny sparks of blue light, swept away into the dark mist. Yet, as his physical form dissolved, the terrible, suffocating fog in his mind cleared. Suddenly, he saw her. He saw his daughter Sarah clearly, not as a smudged memory, but in brilliant, vibrant detail. He saw her bright red bicycle, her messy brown hair, her wide, laughing smile, as she ran across the sunlit grass of their backyard in St. John's. The face he thought he had lost forever returned to him in a rush of overwhelming warmth. Julian let out a long, peaceful breath. He did not fight the wind. He opened his arms and let the fog take him, fading into a streak of pale blue light that rose straight up to the shattered roof of the tower, shooting out into the open sky. Beside the pedestal, Arthur held Leo's small hand tight. Around them, the 1874 stone tower was disappearing, block by block, beam by beam. The 70 feet of timber, the spiral iron staircase, the kitchen with its cold stove, the long oak table, all of the stagnant, 70-year-old sanctuary was collapsing back into the leaden water from which Arthur's grief had built it. The floor beneath their feet melted away. Arthur felt no drop. There was no sensation of falling, no impact of cold water against the skin. Instead, the flat, leaden mercury sea opened like a dark velvet curtain. The rusted hulk of the SS Southern Cross was no longer sitting in the distance. It was right there, gliding silently across the smooth, dark water toward them. Its rusted iron railings were bathed not in sickly green lantern light, but in a soft, quiet gray luminescence that rose from the water itself. Standing on the forward deck, among the hundreds of silent passengers who had waited nearly a century for the turn of the light, was a woman in a dark wool coat and a blue ribbon bonnet. She was looking toward the stone ledge, her hands resting gently on the wooden rail. Leo gasped. His small voice brightened, full of joy Arthur hadn't heard since before the storm. "Mama!" Leo cried out. The boy let go of Arthur's hand and took a step forward, not onto granite, but onto the calm, dark surface of the sea. His small feet left soft, silver ripples on the water. He didn't sink. He walked across the leaden sea toward the ship, his wool sweater whole again, his hair catching a gentle salt breeze. Arthur stood on the last remaining fragment of the Black Ledge rocks. He looked down at his cracked, greasy knuckles one last time. The engine grease was gone. The cuts across his skin were healed. His hands were no longer glass. They were whole, solid, and light. He looked back at the space where the lighthouse had stood for 100 years. There was no tower. There were no iron stairs. There was only a jagged tooth of dark, wet granite, sitting low in the water, washed clean by the sea. Arthur stepped off the stone. The leaden water accepted his boots with a soft, quiet splash. He turned his face toward the bow of the Southern Cross, where Leo was already climbing the wooden gangway into his mother's arms. Arthur took a deep breath of the fresh ocean air that no longer tasted of kerosene or cold ashes, and walked across the quiet sea to join them. Behind him, the fog over the Black Ledge did not roll away. It remained thick, silent, and endless, but inside the mist, no green light turned. No clockwork gears clicked. No bell rang. The ledge was finally dark, and the sea was finally at peace. 22 miles off the southeastern coast of Newfoundland, the morning of August 1st, 2026, broke under a ceiling of low, bruised cloud. The CCGS Hudson, an oceanographic research vessel operating under the charter of the Canadian Coast Guard, rolled rhythmically in 3-foot swells. Her diesel engines produced a steady, low-frequency hum that vibrated through the steel decking of the bridge. Inside the main operations vessel room, illuminated by the pale blue glare of multiple high-resolution monitors, senior sonar operator David Vance pulled off his headset and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. He had been staring at bathymetric sweep data for 6 straight hours. "Anything on the multi-beam?" A voice asked from the chart table behind him. Captain Sarah Vance, no relation to David, though the crew joked about it, walked over holding a steaming mug of black coffee. She was a woman in her late 40s with sharp gray eyes and weathered skin that spoke of 20 years in the North Atlantic. David shook his head, tapping a finger against a glowing glass display. "Nothing sensible, Captain. We're getting weird density inversions right along the eastern perimeter of the trench. The acoustic returns are coming back soft, like we're bouncing signal off suspended mud or thermal air, but the water temp sensors at 300 feet are dead steady at 4.2 degrees Celsius. What about the tether?" Sarah asked, her voice dropping into a quieter, grimmer register. "Any ping from Miller's beacon?" David's hand hesitated over his control console. He pulled up a secondary diagnostic window, showing a series of flatlining telemetry graphs. "No," David said quietly. Julian's primary acoustic transponder dropped offline at 3 hours 42 minutes and 18 seconds local time. Last ping placed him roughly 200 meters south-southwest of the Black Ledge Shoal. His depth was 45 meters, descent rate nominal. Then zip, absolute radio silence. No pressure spike, no emergency ballast deployment, no distress strobe. "That was over 6 hours ago," Sarah murmured, staring out the reinforced bridge windows. Beyond the glass, the ocean did not look like the calm, silver sheet that Arthur had walked upon. It was gray, choppy, and cold, framed by a thick bank of sea fog hovering just 2 miles off their starboard bow. The fog wall stood like a vertical cliff of gray wool, dense enough to hide whatever lay beyond it. Coast Guard Cutter Cape Fox is 3 miles out, assisting with the grid search, David added, bringing up a regional maritime tracking map. They're running surface patterns along the outer reef. "But, Captain, look at this satellite feed from 40 minutes ago." He enlarged a thermal composite view of the search area. At 4:15, roughly 30 minutes after Miller went dark, the regional atmospheric sensors log a localized barometric anomaly directly over the ledge, David explained, tracing a faint green circle on the screen. A pressure drop of nearly 12 millibars in under 2 minutes, confined to a radius of less than a quarter mile. And then he tapped the screen again, advancing the playback frame by frame. "A thermal flare," Sarah noted, leaning closer, her brow furrowing. "It looks like a sharp temperature rise at the surface." "Not heat," David corrected. "A sudden spike in light polarization." For about 3 seconds, the optical sensor on the Sentinel-3 satellite picked up a distinct green wavelength emission coming from the exact coordinates of the old Ledge Light Foundation. Sarah turned her head slowly to look at him. "The Ledge Light has been decommissioned since 1984, David. The old timber housing rotted out 50 years ago. There's nothing on that reef except a rusted steel tripod and a solar LED marker that's been out of service since last November. I know, David said flatly. I'm just telling you what the satellite logged. The door to the bridge slid open with a sharp mechanical hiss. First, Officer Mark Harris stepped inside, carrying a sealed yellow weatherproof folder and a small, clear plastic specimen bag containing a black electronic housing. We just hauled in the primary telemetry buoy from the North Drop, Harris said, stepping up to the chart table. The housing was recovered floating right on the edge of the fog bank. Sarah set her coffee mug down. Is it Miller's? It's a suit-mounted data recorder, Harris confirmed, holding up the clear bag. The black casing inside was scraped, lined with dried salt crust, but the small green status indicator on its side was blinking steadily. The hard drive is sealed. It survived the dive. We just pulled the raw log dump. Put on the main display, Sarah ordered. Harris slotted a high-speed data lead into the console interface. The room was silent save for the hum of the ship's ventilation as the screen flashed, loading thousands of lines of raw dive telemetry. Depth profiles, internal suit pressure, oxygen mix ratios, and skin temperature readings. David scrubbed through the data timeline, stopping at the 340 mark. Okay, David muttered, reading the scrolling numbers. Here's where his main umbilical severed. Suit pressure drops slightly as he switches to bailout gas. Heart rate spikes to 145 beats per minute. He's swimming up, depth decreasing rapidly. 30 meters, 20 meters, 10 meters. He reached the surface, Harris noted. He reached something, David corrected, pointing at the depth curve. The blue line showing Julian's depth did not level out at 0 meters, sea level. At 3 hours, 41 minutes, and 50 seconds, the depth reading plummeted into negative numbers, registering an altitude above the sea surface. 10 meters above sea level? Sarah asked, her voice skeptical. The sensor was faulty. Water must have entered the pressure transducer. Maybe, David said, but look at his internal suit temperature right after the altitude spike. The line representing Julian's core temperature did not drop into the fatal hypothermic range as he sat in the freezing brine. Instead, it stabilized at precisely 37.0 degrees Celsius, a perfect, healthy human body temperature. Then, over the next 20 minutes, the suit's environmental sensors registered an ambient atmosphere that defied every physical law of the North Atlantic. Ambient air temperature, 18.5 degrees Celsius. Ambient pressure, 1,013 hectopascals. Relative humidity, 45%. Composition, trace present of combustion particulates, kerosene smoke, coal ash, vaporized mercury. The three officers stared at the data display in complete, uncomprehending silence. Kerosene? Harris whispered, breaking the quiet. Out on the ledge, Stone? That reef is submerged at high tide. Where the hell would kerosene smoke come from? David didn't answer. He scrolled to the very end of the file. To 4 hours, 15 minutes, and 2 seconds, the exact second the satellite had logged the green light emission over the reef. At that precise moment, the diver's heart rate monitor recorded a sudden, smooth deceleration. 140 BPM, 110 BPM, 80 BPM, 60 BPM. Zero. There was no spike in distress, no surge of adrenaline, no drop in blood oxygen. The line simply flattened into a perfectly straight, quiet mark. And directly below the flatlining vitals, in the automated suit logs text diary, where the diver's internal microphone recorded voice-to-text notes, one single line of audio had been processed and transcribed by the system's software before the recorder detached. Audio input. The light is turned. We are safe inside. Sarah reached out and gripped the edge of the console table. Her knuckles turned white under the fluorescent lights of the bridge. Captain, David said softly, pointing out the forward window. The thick, gray bank of fog that had been sitting 2 miles off their starboard bow was suddenly moving. It wasn't drifting with the wind. It was dissolving. The dense wall of gray mist seemed to lose its structural cohesion, thinning out, turning into wisps of pale steam that evaporated into the morning air. Within 3 minutes, the horizon cleared completely. For the first time in 40 years, the sun broke through the cloud cover over the Black Ledge, casting bright, warm yellow light across the open water. Through her binoculars, Captain Sarah Vance looked out at the coordinates of the reef. The jagged granite tooth of the Black Ledge sat low in the clear blue sea, washed over by gentle, white-capped waves. There was no ghost ship. There was no stone tower. There was only the rusted, empty frame of the old iron marker tripod, sitting silent and dry under the morning sun. And floating in the clear, shallow water just off the southern tip of the reef, held gently by the rising tide, sat two small, distinct objects. A single waterlogged leather boot from an early 20th century keeper's uniform, and a sleek, modern yellow dye mask, resting side by side in the gravel. The formal inquiry began 48 hours after the fog dissipated from the Black Ledge. The Coast Guard Regional Headquarters in St. John sat overlooking the harbor, a modern concrete and glass building that looked out over gray piers, industrial container cranes, and cold ocean water. Inside Conference Room 4B, the air was dry, smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and stale coffee, and offered zero insulation against the sterile glare of fluorescent ceiling panels. Sitting at the center of the long laminate table was Dr. Eris Thorne, a senior forensic oceanographer representing the Transportation Safety Board. Across from him sat Captain Sarah Vance and First Officer Mark Harris, both dressed in their dark Navy service uniforms. Between them lay three physical items sealed in clear hazard bags: Julian Miller's suit-mounted telemetry unit, the waterlogged leather boot recovered from the reef, and Julian's yellow dive mask. Thorne adjusted his glasses, flipping through a thick paper dossier. "Let's go over the timeline again, Captain," Thorne said, his voice measured, devoid of emotion. At 3:40 a.m. on August 1st, diver Julian Miller experienced an umbilical severance at 45 meters. At 4:15 a.m., his telemetry went completely dead. At 7:20 a.m., your crew recovered the telemetry module and the physical artifacts log in report 88A. "That is correct," Sarah said quietly. "And yet," Thorne tapped the dossier with his pen, "your official vessel log contains 3 distinct entries that the board finds problematic." Sarah didn't flinch. "Which entries?" "Entry 1, Thorne read from the report. 7:35 a.m. Upon visual approach to Black Ledge Reef, vessel observed an abrupt, non-meteorological dissipation of localized sea fog across a 4-square-mile grid within 180 seconds. He looked up over his frames. Fog doesn't evaporate at 3 knots without a significant shift in thermal gradient or surface wind. Your own weather station logged 3 knots of air movement. It didn't evaporate, Mark Harris interrupted, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. It dissolved. It was as if the humidity in the air simply ceased to exist. Thorne made a small mark on his notepad, without comment. Entry 2, visual confirmation of historical debris on the ledge stone, specifically hand-worked iron fittings and brick masonry fragments consistent with pre-automated lighthouse construction. Thorne paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Captain Vance, the 1938 ledge tower was completely swept away during a November gale that year. The official Canadian Hydrographic Service record states that the stone superstructure was pulverized by 30-foot breakers and lost to the sea in its entirety. No brick or iron framing remained on the granite tooth after November 14, 1938. Then the official record is wrong," Sarah said firmly. "I walked the low-tide ledge myself with Officer Harris. We found 3 feet of hand-carved granite base block embedded in the reef shelf. It was coated in old lime mortar and salt rot. There was a copper drain fitting still attached to the stone." Thorne leaned back in his leather chair, tapping the pen against his chin. "And what about entry 3? The audio transcription on Miller's suit recorder." The room went completely quiet. The soft hum of the air conditioner was the only sound. "The audio file was verified by our software," Harris said, his voice dropping into a tight register. "The acoustic signature matches Julian Miller's vocal profile at a 98% confidence interval. He spoke 9 words directly before his suit sensors flatlined." Thorne picked up the transparent bag containing the suit recorder, turning it over in his hands. The board's medical examiner reviewed the vitals log. Thorne said, "Hypoxia, nitrogen narcosis, and sudden cardiac arrest due to cold water shock. When a diver suffers rapid asphyxiation in 4-degree water, auditory and visual hallucinations are extremely common. The brain constructs familiar, comforting narratives to cope with sudden neurological collapse. He wasn't suffocating, Sarah said flatly. His core temperature rose to normal body temperature while submerged. His suit pressure held steady until the exact moment his heart stopped. A sensor glitch caused by saltwater intrusion in the telemetry housing. Thorne replied smoothly, setting the bag down with a sharp thud. It's the only logical explanation. And the boot, Harris challenged, gesturing toward the stained, waterlogged leather boot sitting on the table. That isn't modern gear. We ran a historical material analysis at the university lab yesterday afternoon. The leather was tanned using vegetable bark extract. The nails in the heel are hand-forged wrought iron, and the inner lining carries a faint stamp from the St. John's Cordwainers Guild, dated 1922. Thorne stared at the old boot for a long moment. His calm, clinical demeanor flickered, just for a fraction of a second, before hardening back into administrative stoicism. Historical drift, Thorne declared dryly. The North Atlantic shelf is littered with wrecks. A 90-year-old boot washed up on the reef by storm surge is hardly evidence of an anomaly, Officer Harris. He pulled a fresh manila folder from his briefcase, opened it, and slid a document across the table toward Sarah. This inquiry is concluded, Thorne said. The official cause of death for Julian Miller will be logged as accidental tether severance leading to rapid hypothermia and drowning during a routine seabed survey. The Hudson's bathymetric data regarding the ledge will be archived under restricted hydrographic survey files. Sarah looked at the document. It was a standard non-disclosure order, stamped with the red seal of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. You're burying it, Sarah said, not raising her voice, but infusing it with ice. We are closing a file, Captain, Thorne corrected. We don't publish ghost stories in government hydrographic reports. And Miller's family? Sarah asked. What are you telling his wife? Thorne closed his briefcase with 2 sharp clicks of the brass latches. His widow has been notified of his death at sea, Thorne said. Standing up, she was provided with his personal effects recovered from his cabin on the Nautilus II. She is handling it as well as can be expected. He turned and walked toward the heavy oak door of the conference room. Just before stepping into the hallway, he stopped, his hand resting on the brass handle. He didn't turn around. One detail, Captain, Thorne said softly. Sarah looked up. What? We sent a family liaison officer to Miller's residence in St. John's yesterday morning, Thorne murmured, his voice losing its cold administrative edge for the first time, to deliver his logbook and dive watches to his wife. And his widow Clara was there, Thorne continued, looking down at his polished shoes. She has a 4-year-old daughter named Sarah. We know, Sarah Vance said. Miller mentioned her on his suit audio. Yes, Thorne said, turning his head slightly. But when the liaison officer walked into the house, the little girl was sitting on the living room floor, playing with a toy boat. The officer asked her if she knew where her father was. Sarah held her breath. What did the child say? Thorne took a slow, heavy breath. The child said her father went to turn off a big green lamp on the rocks, Thorne whispered, and that he was coming home as soon as the sea was clear. Thorne didn't wait for a response. He opened the door, stepped out into the bright, sterile corridor, and let the heavy-wood click shut behind him. Inside the quiet room, Captain Sarah Vance looked down at the hazard bag containing the old 1922 keeper's boot. She reached out, her fingers pressing against the clear plastic, feeling the hard, ancient shape of the leather beneath. Outside the window, far across the blue water of St. John's Harbor, the morning sun shone bright and warm, reflecting off the ocean without a trace of fog. The house on Maple Street was too quiet. It was a small 2-story wooden home with dark green cladding and white trim, sitting 3 miles inland from the St. John's Harbor. Outside, the afternoon sun of early August baked the cedar shingles, filling the air with the smell of warm resin and dry grass. It was a bright, ordinary summer day, but inside the kitchen, the light felt muted, as it filtered through dirty glass. Clara Miller sat at the small pine table, her fingers wrapped around a cold porcelain mug of tea she hadn't touched in 2 hours. She was 31 years old. Her dark hair pulled back in a loose, untidy knot. Her eyes were rimmed with red. Her face drained of color, hollowed out by the sudden, crushing weight of official condolences. On the table before her sat the black waterproof case the Coast Guard liaison officer had brought by earlier that morning. Julian's personal effects from the Nautilus II. Inside the box were 3 items: his dive watch, his wedding band, and a heavy leather-bound field journal he had kept throughout his 6-month contract with the Oceanographic Survey Team. Across the room, 4-year-old Sarah sat on the worn, braided rug, humming a wordless tune as she pushed a small wooden tugboat through an imaginary sea between the chair legs. She seemed untroubled, enveloped in the soft, impenetrable bubble of early childhood that absorbs tragedy only as a strange, distant murmur. Clara reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she drew Julian's journal toward her. She flipped open the leather cover. The first 50 pages were filled with familiar, neat handwriting, scrawled entries about sonar calibration, sea temperatures, tidal charts, and mundane complaints about the ship's cook. But as she turned to final entries, written during the week leading up to his final dive at the Black Ledge, the handwriting changed. The letters grew larger, rushed, pressed so hard into the paper that the pen nib had nearly torn through the sheets. July 28, 2026. The multi-beam telemetry over the Ledge Shoal is showing structural anomalies that shouldn't exist. Charting says the reef is bare granite, but the acoustic returns keep mapping a 70-foot vertical shadow. It looks like a tower. Every time I mention to Vance, he says it's sea clutter or a sensor artifact. But I heard something on the hydrophone array tonight. It wasn't whales. It sounded like an iron gear turning in dry oil. July 30th, 2026. Dreamed about a light again. Not a modern strobe. A heavy, green flare sweeping across flat water. I could hear someone winding a crank. 30 turns. Clack, clack, clack. I felt cold inside the dream, but it wasn't water cold. It felt like standing in an open doorway while the house rots around you. If the tether snaps on Friday, I need to remember, don't answer the horn. Clara froze, her heart taking a violent, sickening drop against her ribs. Don't answer the horn. Julian had written those words 3 days before his dive. He had never been superstitious. He was an engineer, a man who measured his life in atmospheres of pressure, gas mixtures, and acoustic frequencies. Yet here, on the lined paper of his private journal, were the exact warnings of an old maritime legend. Clara turned to the very last page. It was dated August 1st, 3:15 a.m., less than half an hour before it entered the water. The handwriting was nearly illegible, scrawled in a frantic hurry. The sea is flat tonight. Looks like Mercury. Sarah's red bike is in the garage. Tell her I turned the lamp off. Clara pressed her palm over her mouth, a dry, choked sob tearing from her throat. Mommy? Sarah stopped humming. She left her wooden boat on the rug and walked over to the table, her small canvas shoes clicking softly against the floorboards. She reached up, placing her small, warm hand against Clara's knee. Why are you crying, Mommy? Clara wiped her eyes furiously with her sleeve, trying to force a reassuring smile that felt like glass cracking on her face. I'm okay, sweetheart, Clara rasped, leaning down to scoop the little girl into her lap, holding her tight against her chest. I miss Daddy. Sarah didn't cry. She rested her head against Clara's shoulder, staring at the open journal on the table. Daddy isn't under the water, Sarah said matter-of-factly. Her voice was calm, sweet, completely devoid of fear. Clara pulled back slightly, looking into her daughter's hazel eyes. What do you mean, baby? He came by my window this morning, Sarah said, picking at a loose thread on Clara's sweater, before the sun came up. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Sarah, you were dreaming. No, the little girl insisted softly, shaking her head. I wasn't asleep. He had his bright yellow jacket on, but it wasn't wet. He walked into my room and sat on the bed. Clara felt a cold prickle of terror run down her spine, mixing with the overwhelming grief. Did he say something to you? He said he would go to the old keeper, Sarah murmured, her small fingers tracing a circle on the pine table. He said the light was out now, so the little boy could go find his mama on the big boat, and he told him to look under the hallway rug. Clara stared at her daughter. The kitchen was dead silent. The ticking of the wall clock seemed to slow down, echoing with a heavy, deliberate clack, clack, clack. Slowly, as if moving through knee-deep water, Clara set Sarah down on the floor. She walked out of the kitchen and into the dark, narrow hallway that ran between the living room and the front door. At the foot of the stairs lay a small, braided wool runner rug that had belonged to Julian's grandmother. Clara knelt beside the rug. Her hands were cold, trembling so badly she could barely grip the edge of the fabric. She pulled the rug back. There, on the dark, varnished oak floorboard beneath, boards that had been dry, cleaned, and vacuumed just yesterday, lay a small, perfect circle of white residue. Clara reached out and touched it with her index finger. It wasn't dust. It wasn't chalk. It was fine crystalline sea salt, pressed deep into the grain of the wood in the distinct shape of a small child's bare footprint, and right beside it the clear, heavy outline of a man's wet leather heel. Clara pressed her salty finger to her lips. It tasted of old brine, cold granite, and deep, quiet water. She sat back on her heels in the quiet hallway, looking down at the white marks on the floor. For the first time since the Coast Guard officers had knocked on her door, the suffocating, tearing panic in her chest receded. She looked up through the small stained-glass window above the front door. The afternoon light streamed through the yellow panes, casting a warm, golden pool across the rug. Out on the coast, 20 miles away, the sea sat clear and calm under the blue sky. The Black Ledge was just a rock in the water now, washed over by the tide, its long, green shadow gone forever. Clara reached out, gently pulled the braided rug back over the footprints, and went back into the kitchen to make her daughter lunch. Decades passed over the North Atlantic with the slow, indifferent weight of deep water. By the summer of 2066, the story of the Black Ledge had faded into the quiet margins of local maritime lore. The automated survey vessels that mapped the Grand Banks used satellite LiDAR and deep-penetrating multi-beam sonar that rendered the seabed in flawless, three-dimensional clarity. On their digital charts, the ledge was nothing more than an elevation point, a hazard of shallow draft navigation, marked in pale blue depth contours on computer screens in St. John's. No modern chart noted the stone tower that had stood there in 1938. No hydrographic survey registered the green light that had once turned to the gray wool of the fog. In a quiet coastal home overlooking the cliffs of Cape Spear, an elderly woman sat by a wide bay window. Sarah Miller was 60 years old now. Her dark hair was streaked silvered, her face lined with the gentle geometry of a life lived by the ocean. On the small wooden side table beside her armchair rested 3 items: an old leather-bound field journal with yellowed pages, a small glass vial containing white salt crystals collected from a hallway floorboard 6 decades ago, and a worn photograph of her father, Julian, wearing his yellow dive suit aboard the Nautilus II. Through the window, the Atlantic stretched out to the eastern horizon. It was a clear, crisp September afternoon. The water was a brilliant, sparkling indigo, flecks of white foam dancing across the waves under a pale blue sky. A young man, her grandson, Leo, stepped into the sunlit room carrying 2 mugs of tea. He was 22, with dark hair and bright hazel eyes that mirrored the photograph on the table. "Still watching the water, Gran?" Leo asked softly, setting a mug down beside the journal. Sarah smiled, her eyes never leaving the sea. "It's a good day for watching, Leo. The visibility is 20 miles. Leo stood beside her chair, looking out over the water. "Did you ever wish you'd gone out there? To the ledge?" "No," Sarah said, her voice rich and steady. There was nothing out there to find, not after the light went out. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the cool glass of the salt vial. She remembered the years after 2026. She remembered her mother, Clara, who had lived a quiet, peaceful life, never once speaking of Julian with bitterness or unresolved grief. Clara had understood what few in the Coast Guard or the inquiry boards could ever grasp, that Julian hadn't been stolen by the sea. He had stepped across a threshold to help an old keeper and a small, lost boy find their way home. "My mother used to tell me that people build lighthouses because they're afraid of the dark," Sarah murmured, turning her eyes to her grandson. "They think if they can just keep a flame burning, time won't touch them. They think they can keep the house safe forever." "And can they?" Leo asked. "No," Sarah replied softly. All a lamp does when it burns too long is keep the morning from coming. Sometimes, the bravest thing a keeper can do is blow out the mantle. Down below the cliffs, 3 miles out on a clear indigo sea, the waves broke gently against the dark granite tooth of the Black Ledge. There were no ghosts on the stone. There were no pale, jointed arms reaching from a mist. There were no rusted coal steamers waiting on a leaden sea of mercury, and no 3-hour turns of an iron crank echoing up a spiral staircase. The dark rock sat clean under the open sun. Sea gulls rested on the granite shelf, preening their white feathers in the salt breeze. Beneath the surface, cold, clear water washed over the ancient, lime-mortar base blocks of the 1874 tower, smoothing their sharp edges, turning them slowly back into ordinary sand. Out on the deep shelf, 50 fathoms down where the sunlight faded into quiet blue gloom, the water moved in long, rhythmic currents, a vast, unbroken tide that belonged neither to 1938 nor 2026. It was simply the sea, quiet, deep, and finally at peace.